In the crumbling ruins of a frontier boomtown, you might find it half buried in the dust. A dented tin can, its label long since peeled away, its edges curled and oxidized by decades of wind and sand. It sits there in silence, as though discarded yesterday, and yet it has outlived the town itself. No voices, no footsteps, just this small, stubborn object, and the question lingers. How did it get here? Not just who dropped it or when, but how it traveled. Because this place is hundreds of miles from any cannery, any factory, any coastline where such things were made. That single tin can is not debris. It is evidence. A fragment of a system so vast, so strained, that it stretched across an entire continent just to place this one object into a man's hand. The West, for all its myths of isolation, was never alone. The stories we are told prefer simplicity. A man rides into town with a bedroll and a rifle, dust at his heels, purpose in his stride. The camera lingers on him as though he is self-contained, self-sufficient. But what the stories never show is what follows behind him. Not immediately visible, not within the frame, but always there. A freight wagon. Not one, but dozens, sometimes hundreds, crawling across the horizon days or weeks behind him. Each wagon carrying the weight of civilization itself, tools, nails, fabric, flour, ammunition, coffee, lamp oil, spare parts, stoves, boots, and yes, tins of preserved food. Everything required to turn empty land into something habitable. The truth is heavier than the myth. The frontier was not built by lone men. It was fed, maintained, and sustained by an immense logistical network, a system of supply that began in the industrial centers of the East, places of smoke, steel, and mass production, and ended here, in towns that could not survive a single missed delivery. Every object had a lineage. A shovel began as iron ore dug from western ground, shipped east, refined in furnaces, shaped by machines, sold through layers of merchants, then packed, hauled, and dragged back west again. A shirt might pass through cotton fields, textile mills, warehouses, and rail depots before ever touching a settler's back. Even the nails holding together a cabin wall had traveled further than the man who hammered them in. The West did not produce its own life. It imported it. But hauling goods across such distances was not merely difficult, it was punishing. The land itself resisted the idea, and this is where the myth fractures completely, because the real story belongs not to the riders, but to the men walking beside the wagons. They were called bullwhackers and mule skinners, names that sound almost comic until you understand what they endured. A bullwhacker did not sit proudly atop his wagon like a driver in a parade. He walked, always walked, mile after mile, day after day, through heat that warped the air and cold that cracked the skin. His wagon was not a light carriage. It was a moving mass of timber and iron, oak frames reinforced with bolts, wheels taller than a man's chest, axles groaning under loads that could reach several tons. Even empty, such a wagon could weigh as much as a small modern vehicle. Loaded, it became something closer to a moving building, and it moved at a pace that defied urgency. 2 miles an hour. That was the reality. Not the galloping horse, not the dramatic charge across open land, but a slow, grinding crawl. 2 miles in an hour, perhaps 15 in a full day if nothing went wrong, and something always went wrong. Wheels splintered, axles cracked, animals collapsed, rivers swelled without warning, turning crossings into lethal traps. Mud could swallow a wagon whole, holding it in place until men unloaded it piece by piece just to free it. And still they moved forward. The bullwhacker's whip was not for cruelty, but for communication. A sharp crack above the oxen's heads, guiding them, urging them, keeping rhythm. The animals themselves, oxen or mules, were chosen not for speed but for endurance. They could pull immense weight, survive on sparse grazing, and continue when a horse would fail. But even they had limits. Imagine the desert stretches, heat rising from the ground like a second sun. The air so dry it pulls moisture from the lungs with every breath. A team of animals harnessed together, each step dragging iron-shod wheels across sand that resists like water. The driver walking beside them, his boots filling with dust, his tongue thick with thirst. Now, imagine doing that for 10 days straight. There were wagons in Death Valley that carried over 30 tons of borax. 30 tons, pulled by teams of 20 mules across 160 miles of desert with no margin for failure. If a wheel broke, there was no rescue. If water ran out, there was no relief. Every journey was calculated risk, but hauling goods across the land was only half the battle, because when those goods finally arrived, another problem emerged, one that was less visible but just as deadly: fuel. The Great Plains were vast, open, and almost entirely treeless. To build a fire, something so basic it is taken for granted, became a daily challenge. There were no forests to cut, no easy supply of wood to burn. Settlers adapted in ways that reveal just how fragile their existence truly was. They burned dung, buffalo chips dried under the sun, gathered by hand, stacked and stored like precious cargo. These were not a convenience, they were a necessity. Without them, there was no heat, no cooked food, no survival through winter nights that could freeze water solid within hours. Even this required labor. Women and children often spent hours each day collecting fuel from the land, turning waste into warmth. Later, when agriculture took hold, corn cobs replaced dung. Special stoves were designed to burn hay, fed through metal tubes into a firebox that devoured whatever could be spared. Wood, when it could be found, was often green and wet. It had to be dried artificially before it would burn, placed inside ovens just to prepare it for use as fuel. Every flame in the frontier was earned. And then there was water, not for drinking, but for machines. The arrival of the railroad did not simplify logistics. It transformed them into something even more demanding. Steam locomotives were not efficient, they were insatiable. For every unit of fuel they consumed, they required several times more water. Water that had to be sourced, stored, and delivered along routes that often crossed deserts and arid plains. So, the railroads built infrastructure not just for movement, but for survival. Water towers rose beside tracks at regular intervals. Tanks filled from rivers, wells, or hauled supplies. Engineers planned routes based not only on distance, but on where water could be found. A train could not simply continue if its supply ran dry. It would stop, and in stopping, it would halt everything behind it. Because freight did not move independently. It moved in chains, and those chains extended beyond physical goods. Information itself became a logistical burden. Before the telegraph, a message traveled only as fast as a horse could run or a ship could sail. A letter from one end of the continent to the other could take weeks, sometimes longer. And those weeks were not empty time. They were filled with uncertainty. A merchant might order supplies and wait, not knowing if they had been shipped, delayed, or lost. A mining operation might depend on news of investment or equipment, with every passing day draining resources. A warning of danger, a hostile encounter, a failed crop, a financial collapse might arrive too late to matter. Delay was not inconvenience, it was risk. The Pony Express attempted to bridge this gap, pushing riders and horses to their limits in a relay system designed for speed. But speed came at a cost so high that only the most urgent messages justified it. Even then, it was temporary. Within a year, the telegraph rendered it obsolete. A message could now cross the continent in minutes, but access was limited, the cost remained high, and the infrastructure itself, lines, poles, stations, had to be built and maintained across thousands of miles of hostile terrain. Poles shipped from distant forests, transported by sea, then hauled inland just to create a network that could carry words through wire. Even communication had weight, and when that system faltered, the consequences rippled outward. A delayed telegram could mean missed opportunities, failed deals, lost fortunes. Entire towns could hinge on information arriving at the right moment. A rumor of gold could create a boom. The confirmation of its absence could empty a town overnight, which brings us back to the tin can. Because by the time it was opened, its journey was already complete. It had passed through factories, warehouses, rail depots, wagon trains, and distribution points. It had been bought, sold, transported, delayed, risked, and finally delivered, and then consumed. Discarded without ceremony, as though it had always been there. But it had not. It was the endpoint of a chain so complex that its failure at any stage could have prevented its existence entirely. And this is the part the stories rarely acknowledge. The West was not just built, it was maintained. Constantly. Every town existed on borrowed continuity. Stores stocked only as long as wagons arrived. Rail lines functioned only as long as water and fuel were available. Communication flowed only as long as the lines held. Remove one element, and the system strained. Remove several, and it collapsed. Ghost towns are not mysteries. They are outcomes, places where the supply chain broke down, where goods stopped arriving, where information lagged too far behind events, where investment dried up or resources failed. When the flow ceased, life followed. What remains is silence, and objects, a rusted stove, a collapsed water tower, a line of telegraph poles reduced to stumps, and sometimes a dented tin can, still holding its shape against the slow erosion of time. Each one a marker, not of independence but of dependence, not of isolation but of connection. Because the frontier was never separate from the industrial world. It was an extension of it, a distant limb, sustained by arteries of steel, wood, water, and human endurance. And if you follow those arteries backwards, they lead not into wilderness, but into factories, into cities, into a network that stretched far beyond what the eye could see. So, the next time you imagine a lone rider crossing an empty landscape, remember what follows behind him. Not just a wagon, but an entire system, creaking under its own weight, holding together just long enough to make that journey possible. And understand this. To survive the frontier, you didn't just need a gun, you needed a supply chain. But even that supply chain, vast, grinding, and relentless, was never stable. It only appeared solid when everything worked, when the wagons arrived on time, when the rivers stayed low enough to cross, when the animals held their footing and the wheels held their shape, when the men endured. The moment one piece faltered, the illusion collapsed. Consider what happened when supplies finally reached a town. Not relief, not comfort, but tension. Because arrival did not guarantee distribution. Goods had to be unloaded, counted, priced, and often fought over. Merchants operated on thin margins, balancing credit extended months earlier against the reality of what had survived the journey. A crate broken in transit could mean the difference between profit and loss. A shipment delayed could mean shelves sitting empty while customers grew restless. And time, always time, pressed in. Flour spoiled. Salt meat rotted if improperly stored. Tools rusted. Cloth mildewed. Every object carried not just weight, but vulnerability. The journey did not end at arrival. It simply changed form. Behind the counters of frontier stores stood men who were less shopkeepers and more logisticians. They tracked inventories with obsessive care, knowing that a missing item could not be replaced with a quick order. Replenishment meant waiting weeks, sometimes months, for the next freight train or wagon column. And if that column failed to arrive, there was no contingency. This was not commerce as we understand it. It was survival through calculation. Credit stretched across distances as vast as the land itself. A miner might buy supplies on promise of future gold. A farmer might take tools against the hope of a harvest. Merchants, in turn, relied on Eastern financiers who rarely saw the land they invested in. Paper agreements traveled slowly, often arriving long after circumstances had changed. And yet, the system functioned, barely, because it had to. The frontier was not sustained by abundance, but by constant adjustment. When wood ran out, people burned dung. When wagons broke, goods were carried by hand. When animals died, loads were redistributed, journeys slowed, expectations lowered. Everything bent, but nothing could break entirely. And still, the land demanded more. Distances were not simply long, they were consuming. A journey measured in miles was also measured in fatigue, in wear, in loss. Every mile increased the chance of failure. Every mile added strain to wood and iron, to muscle and bone, and the land itself offered no mercy. Storms could erase trails overnight, leaving wagons to navigate by memory and instinct. Snow could trap entire caravans, forcing men to ration supplies meant for others. Heat could warp metal, crack leather, and drain animals to the point of collapse. There were no guarantees. Even the roads, if they could be called that, were temporary. Tracks carved into the earth by repeated use, then erased by wind or rain. A route that worked one season might be impassable the next. Drivers learned to read the land as much as to follow it, adjusting constantly to conditions that shifted without warning. And yet, despite all of this, the system expanded. Railroads pushed further west, laying track across plains and mountains, each mile requiring labor, materials, and coordination on a scale that mirrored the very system it sought to support. Iron rails, wooden ties, spikes, tools, all of it had to be transported to the very place it would enable future transport. A paradox of logistics. To build the infrastructure, you needed the infrastructure. And so, the work advanced in stages. Supplies moved to the edge of progress, where new track was laid, extending the reach of the system incrementally. Each new section reduced travel time, lowered costs, and shifted the balance of power. Towns connected to rail lines thrived. Those left behind withered. Because once the railroad arrived, the freight wagon, once the lifeline, became secondary. Faster transport meant fresher goods, more reliable delivery, and lower risk. But it also meant dependence on a new system, one just as fragile in its own way. Tracks could be damaged, bridges could fail, water supplies could dry up. A single disruption could halt entire networks, leaving towns isolated once again. Progress did not eliminate fragility, it redistributed it. And through all of this, information continued to lag behind reality. Even with the telegraph, communication required infrastructure, operators, and cost. Messages were condensed, stripped to essentials, each word carrying weight because each word carried expense. There was no room for nuance, no space for delay. A misinterpreted message could have consequences as severe as a missing shipment. And for those without access to telegraph lines, nothing changed at all. Letters still traveled by wagon or stagecoach, still subject to the same delays and dangers as any other cargo. Weeks could pass between question and answer, between problem and response. Imagine making decisions under those conditions, investing money, committing labor, risking lives, all without certainty, all without immediate feedback. The frontier was not just physically distant, it was temporally distant. Events unfolded faster than they could be communicated, leaving people to act on incomplete information, and sometimes to act too late. This is how towns died, not with sudden violence but with quiet disruption. A delayed shipment, a failed investment, a broken line of communication, each small failure accumulating until the system could no longer sustain itself. The wagons stopped coming, the trains passed by, the letters ceased, and what remained was stillness, buildings left to weather, tools left to rust, goods left unused, and somewhere among them that dented tin can, unchanged in its silence, because the objects outlast the system that created them. Beyond the wagons, beyond the rails, beyond even the telegraph wires stretching thin across empty sky, there was something larger at work, something less visible, but far more powerful. The frontier was not the edge of civilization, it was its extension. Every object that arrived in those distant towns carried with it the imprint of industry, not just in form, but in origin. Iron tools shaped by machines in eastern foundries, cloth woven in mills where thousands worked in shifts measured by whistles, not sunlight, ammunition stamped, measured, calibrated with precision that could only exist in a factory system. The West did not create these things. It consumed them, and in return, it fed something back. Ore, pulled from mountains, raw and unrefined, traveled east to become the material of industry. Gold, silver, copper, these were not merely treasures, they were fuel. Not for stoves or engines, but for economies, for expansion, for the very machinery that would produce the next shipment of goods bound for the frontier. It was a cycle, unbalanced but continuous. The further west the system stretched, the more it demanded. More rails, more wagons, more labor, more capital. Each new settlement was not an endpoint, but another node in the network, another place that required supply, communication, maintenance, and each new node increased the strain, because distance was not just measured in miles, it was measured in delay, in cost, in risk. Every additional mile of track required inspection. Every additional wagon route required upkeep. Every telegraph line required repair when storms tore it down or when isolation allowed it to decay. Expansion was expensive. Maintenance was relentless. And yet, the system pushed outward anyway, driven by the promise of resources, by the lure of profit, by the belief that the land itself would justify the effort required to tame it. Investors in eastern cities poured money into ventures they would never see. Mines were dug deeper, railroads laid further, towns sprang up almost overnight, built on expectation as much as reality. And for a time, it worked. Goods flowed, people arrived, money circulated, the system held, but holding required balance. And balance, on the frontier, was always temporary. Consider a mining town at its peak. Wagons arriving regularly, loaded with supplies, rail connections expanding, reducing travel time, telegraph lines buzzing with information, linking the town to markets far beyond its immediate reach. It appears stable, prosperous. But beneath that stability lies dependence. If the ore runs thin, the flow reverses. Investment slows, shipments decrease, credit tightens, merchants begin to hesitate, ordering less, holding back. Wagons arrive lighter, trains stop less frequently, messages become less urgent, less frequent. And then, almost imperceptibly, the system begins to unwind, because it was never designed to sustain itself without constant input. The frontier did not fail all at once. It faded. A delay here, a missed delivery there, a broken rail not repaired in time, a telegraph line down longer than expected. Each disruption small, almost insignificant on its own, but together they formed a pattern, a weakening, and once the flow slowed, it rarely recovered. The cost of restarting was often too great. Investors moved on. Laborers followed opportunity elsewhere. The network retracted, focusing on places that still justified its expense. And so, towns were left behind, not destroyed but abandoned. Structures standing empty, tools left where they were last used, goods remaining unsold or unused. The infrastructure that once sustained them, roads, rails, wires, either repurposed or left to decay. What remains today is not just the memory of those places, but the physical imprint of the system that once sustained them. Look closely at a ghost town, and you can trace its lifelines. The faint depression in the earth where wagons once passed, their weight carving paths into the soil, the remnants of a water tower, its base still marking where trains once stopped to drink, the alignment of buildings facing a track that no longer carries anything at all. And scattered among these traces, the smaller objects, a broken bottle, a rusted hinge, a dented tin can, each one a fragment, but together forming a pattern that reveals the truth, that nothing here was ever truly isolated, that every object depended on something far away, that the frontier was not a place apart, but a place connected, fragilely, constantly, and at great cost, to a world that most of its inhabitants would never see. This is the part the myth cannot carry, because the myth depends on simplicity, on the idea that survival came from individual strength, from self-reliance, from the ability to exist independently of others. But the reality is heavier. Survival required systems, complex, interdependent systems that stretched across distance and time, systems that demanded coordination, labor, and resources far beyond what any single person could provide. The lone rider, for all his symbolism, was only ever the visible edge of something much larger. Behind him were the factories, the financiers, the laborers, the drivers, the engineers. Behind him were the wagons, the rails, the wires. Behind him were the countless decisions and calculations that allowed him to exist in that moment, in that place, with the equipment he carried and the supplies he consumed. Without that system, he does not arrive. Without that system, the town does not exist. Without that system, the tin can is never there to be found. And this is where the weight of it settles. Because when we look at those remnants today, we are not just seeing what was left behind. We are seeing what was lost when the system that sustained them finally gave way. Not through catastrophe, but through absence. The absence of movement, the absence of supply, the absence of connection, and in that absence, the land reclaims what was briefly imposed upon it. Roads fade, structures collapse, metal corrodes, wood rots. The signs of human effort dissolve back into the environment that resisted them from the beginning. All except for a few stubborn objects. Objects like that dented tin can. Still there, still holding its shape. A quiet reminder that for a brief period, an entire continent was connected by effort alone. That thousands of people, most of whom will never be remembered, worked to move matter across impossible distances just to sustain places that would one day disappear. And that everything, every meal, every tool, every message, depended on that movement continuing without interruption. Because once it stopped, everything else followed. And so what remains is not the frontier as it was imagined, but the frontier as it actually existed. Fragile, overextended, and always one missed delivery away from collapse. Stand over a modern map, and the distances seem manageable. Lines are straight, routes are fixed, travel is measured in hours, not weeks. It is easy to forget that these same stretches of land once resisted every attempt to cross them. That each mile once carried a cost measured in effort, in risk, in time that could not be recovered. Now, strip that map of its infrastructure, remove the highways, remove the railways, remove the fuel stations, the pipelines, the electrical grid, the digital signals. What remains begins to resemble the world those wagons faced, vast, indifferent, and largely empty. And into that space, imagine trying to move weight. Not people alone, but goods, bulk, necessity, the things required not just to travel, but to stay, to build, to endure. Every pound becomes a problem. Every mile becomes a calculation. This is the reality that sustained the frontier. A reality built not on freedom from systems, but on total dependence upon them, because the West was never conquered in the way stories suggest. It was negotiated with, constantly, through logistics, through compromise, through the steady, grinding movement of materials across distances that strained both man and machine. And it never truly yielded. Even at its height, even when railroads stitched coast to coast and telegraph wires carried voices faster than any horse could run, the system remained vulnerable. A broken bridge could isolate entire regions, a drought could halt trains, a financial panic in the East could ripple outward, cutting off the flow of capital that kept everything moving. The frontier did not become stable, it became momentarily balanced, and balance in such a system is always temporary. Look again at the remnants. The ghost towns scattered across deserts and plains are not failures in the traditional sense. They are endpoints, places where the equation no longer worked, where the cost of maintaining connection exceeded the value returned, where the system withdrew, not out of neglect, but out of necessity. What they leave behind is a kind of honesty, a clarity about what it actually took to sustain life in those places. Not romance, not independence, but coordination, labor, infrastructure, a continuous, unbroken chain linking distant production to immediate survival. Break that chain, and everything unravels. This is why the small objects matter, because they are the most honest records we have. A rusted stove speaks of fuel that had to be gathered or transported. A shattered bottle speaks of fragile goods carried over rough terrain. And that dented tin can, so easily dismissed, speaks of industry, preservation, transport, distribution, and consumption, all bound together in a single, ordinary thing. It is the endpoint of effort. And it is still here, long after the roads that carried it have faded, long after the wagons have stopped, long after the people who depended on it have gone. It remains as proof that the frontier was never empty, never simple, never self-sufficient. It was supplied, constantly, relentlessly, at great cost, and when that supply faltered, even briefly, the illusion of permanence vanished, because permanence was never part of the design. The system was not built to last forever. It was built to function, just long enough, just well enough, to sustain life under conditions that resisted it at every turn. That is the truth hidden beneath the stories. The man riding into town was not the beginning of anything. He was the final link in a chain that stretched back across mountains, rivers, factories, and oceans. A chain held together by people who would never see the place their labor reached. And once that chain broke, the story ended. Not with a gunshot, not with a final stand, but with silence. The kind of silence that settles slowly as movement fades and the last wagon fails to arrive. The kind that leaves behind only the evidence of what once was, a scattering of objects, a pattern in the earth, a structure without purpose. And among them, that tin can. Still waiting, still asking the same question. How did it get here? And now, perhaps, you know the answer. Not easily, not simply, but through a system so vast, so fragile, and so relentlessly human that it held together an entire frontier, until, inevitably, it did not.